Hi, I'm your host Vasco Duarte. Welcome to the Scrum Master Toolbox podcast, where we share tips and tricks from Scrum Masters around the world. Every day, we bring you inspiring answers to important questions that all Scrum Masters face day after day. Hello, everybody. Welcome to a very special episode with a previous guest, Justin Chapman. Hi, Justin. Welcome back.
Hey, Vasco. Thanks for having me back.
Absolutely. So Justin's been a guest before on the podcast. He's a product and agile coach with product management experience, ranging from payments to enterprise custom build. Justin has hosted a small series on product management and another series on being a Scrum Master. And he's also pioneered a new canvas to help bring teams together. All of this information can be found on his blog. The link is on the show post, of course. That's ponolabs.com. Justin, welcome back. And you've recently wrote a book titled Become One of Today's Top Agile Leaders. What got you? What prompted you to write that book?
Thanks, Vasco. Yeah, I just published an ebook on, as you mentioned, becoming one of today's top agile leaders. And the mindset there is just, I found, but between doing some consulting work and working my regular day job, that there was a perspective out there where organizations say, they're thinking like, yeah, agile will work. We want to do it, right? So they're kind of bought in from like what they had been doing, whatever the previous frameworks or the way they were working before, and realizing like, hey, psychological safety is a good thing. We want to embrace that sort of, given today's times. So they're bought in from that perspective. But then there's that, I'll call it, we've heard that phrase, crossing the chasm, right? Sort of that little gap where it's like, hey, people have a perspective on kind of where they want to go, right? But then there's the tactical part, which I'll say is sometimes a little bit more difficult. Like, where you want to go, kind of like losing weight. And you're like, in some cases, you're not sure how to, get there. Everyone's got sort of a challenge that they need to overcome. Some people, they just don't like, sort of working out and exercising. Some people, that's fine, but it's sort of like, how do I eat right? So everyone's got to figure out their own sort of script and their own sort of approach to get to the goal that they're seeking. And so this ebook is really focused on that component, right? So
you mean like the actions that people take, or the motivation for the actions? What do you mean?
It's actually a little bit of both. So for example, it's you've got the motivations. And so like, here are some things to help you stay motivated and understand that when you see some tough times, whatever it might be, that you should stay motivated, and then some practical ways to give yourself a support network in your organizational environment. So a way that's constructive, because we're all gonna have tough situations. There's absolutely zero way to get around that. So you're gonna have a tough situation or two or five or whatever it might be. And the more you practice having the conversations with other people in the community, at the company, and sort of figuring that out. So this is an ebook really dedicated to those two tangible things, hands-on practical components to help with the motivation, and then practical steps to keep experimenting and trying to developing the craft of being an agile leader. So it's not focused specifically on being a Scrum Master, but Scrum Masters and coaches will get a lot of value out of it too. It's really to try and help those people who have that mindset and want to work in that different way.
Absolutely. One of the things that you mentioned, which I think is critical for Scrum Masters, those that are getting started, but also those that are facing difficult moments, no matter what their level of experience might be, is to get that support network in the organizations where we work. Share with us some of the tips, 1-2 tips that you share also in the book, and others maybe you've learned since then, about how to create that support network in the organizations where we are and in our communities.
Sure. Well, without giving away too much in the ebook, there is one area that I think answers directly what you're asking. And so I'd say it's the component where you don't necessarily have to be an executive, but if you are an executive, this works just as well. It's the types of questions that we ask when we're talking, not specifically to the team, but to the support network, right? So whether it be to the product manager, to the Scrum Master, if you happen to not be, or if we happen to be a Scrum Master and we're asking directors and we're trying to help foster that mindset. And so this is an excerpt from the book, which is specifically ask if the team has failed recently, ask collaboration questions, ask customer interaction questions, ask about prioritization and trade-offs, right? And so that's really getting at, is the team taking risks and building trust? Is the team getting it quote unquote right? And so the team has to have figured out what right is, and this is the larger team, not necessarily the product delivery team, but if you're talking to your manager and you're say a product manager and you go like, hey, how is the team collaborating? And asking the larger, if you're using any type of scaling frameworks, right? How is the larger executive action team collaborating? How is that working? So the questions can go up and down, right? It's not just one directional where it's all based on the product delivery team. These same questions can work for the product delivery team, and they can work up to the executive level. And the nice part about it is the question is, in the way that it's formed, prompting the listener, the receiver of the question, to respond in kind, which is around that mindset associated with what we're looking for, as opposed to, are we on schedule, right? That's not really what we're looking for. I mean, we'd like to know that, right? But ultimately, what we're really trying to understand, the intent is, do we have the right prioritizations? Are we making the right trade-offs? Are we doing that type
we even understand why we are doing the product
and so think about
decisions we are doing.
Exactly. And so like if you think about the idea of when you've been in any environment and you're really trying to ask, when you've been a leader yourself, when you're asking the question about schedule and some other things, however you may have asked it before, asking it this way is saying, well, are you experimenting with things? Are you trying new things that might help us get to what we're looking for? And that's implicit as part of the question itself. So it helps to reinforce the mindset. And so I won't say it's subtle, because when you're new to it, whether you're the Scrum Master or if you're in product or some other area, it stands out, and it's a different way of asking. And then, so that's one component. But then once a lot of people start asking and using these types of questions, now you know that the organization is in a healthy direction, sort of moving in that constructive way. And so that's another.
So definitely the questions are an important set of tools we have in our toolbox as Scrum Masters. But what is overall the main message you want the readers to take away from the book that you just wrote?
So the overall message is about craftsmanship and how what we're doing has many layers, similar to an onion. And so if you're a year or two into being a Scrum Master and you've sort of figured out like, hey, this is for you, and you've come from some other area or other discipline, and you're trying to figure out, hey, how do I get to that next level? So specifically, Scrum Masters are going to get a lot out of this to really supercharge the craftsmanship of being a Scrum Master and eventually a coach, if that's the direction that they'd like to go. And then ultimately, if you're any other type of actor in an environment that's looking to really supercharge the way the environment works, then there's going to be elements in here to really help you understand how to support product teams in a way that's constructive to support their overall success, which ultimately comes back to your craftsmanship. But for that person, it might not be 100% related. So if you're an executive in ops or a manager in ops, then it might not be 100% related, but you'll be able to get a good chunk of healthy advice and tangible actions that you can take away to support your teams to help get them moving in the way that you're looking. So that's the motivation, and that's I think the helpful part.
Very good. And how do you focus on helping the readers become, top agile leaders? What are the aspects, the areas that you focus on, that you talk about in the book, that make up that world-class agile leader?
Great. That's a great question. So the areas that I talk about are how you hire for character. And so the idea is, and what I mean, I define what it means, obviously, for character versus skill and what that is. But ultimately, you're trying to look for someone who, regardless of the skills you've got, ultimately is going to continue getting better, and they want themselves to get better outside of any motivations that anyone else may impose on them. So hiring those types of folks are really going to help the team be successful, because they're asking this question themselves, right? So you don't need to go prompt them or figure out a way to prompt them. They're naturally chasing that down themselves. So that's one area that's really helpful. And then Another set is setting folks up for learning and then support. And then another area is, how am I doing? How do you do that own self-reflection? How do we actually do that in a way that's constructive without just saying, hey, I stink or I made a mistake, right? Like, you got to acknowledge that you can do better for sure. But how do we do it in a way where you're not looking at yourself as a flawed actor and a practitioner, but looking at it like, hey, here's how I can get better. And here, because your team needs you, right? Like, your team needs you to be successful and they need you to get better. And so if you're spending time not in that introspective approach, then you can really get down on yourself and then you're not able to really contribute to the team.
Yeah, and it is about moving from self-defeat to self-improvement, right? It's like there's a very fine line between those two threads.
Yeah. And so I'd say this really is approached on how to do the latter, which is more helpful and supportive to not only yourself and the team, and then holding teams accountable and the organization accountable. I know sometimes that's a topic that seems like that if you're a coach, you're supposed to maybe not be so focused on, but I think that's an area where we can really hold folks accountable in a way that's constructive.
So let's dive into that though, Justin. So you talk about that as one of the steps that I think it's never easy to execute this, holding teams and organizations accountable. So for starters, share with us, what do you mean by holding teams and organizations accountable?
So for me, holding teams accountable is let's pick a really easy example, because this should probably resonate with a lot of folks, and it's not specifically indicative of my current employer or anyone else. It's just a problem that a lot of folks have or have had, which is a team will say, hey, we're going to do X in a sprint, and then we'll just say they're using Scrum, so they're going to get a certain amount of work done in a sprint. And for the last 4 sprints, they don't get done what they say they're going to get done. So they're constantly rolling over work. That's, I think, is a common pattern for teams who have just shifted or teams that have been working with Scrum, quote unquote, for a little bit. And so ultimately, there are a couple of different ways. Actually, there's a few different ways to really sort of get at that. And so one is a technique which your listeners are probably familiar with, which is using 5 whys. So that's an approach that I detail about how to work with. And then how do you bake that in to actual retrospectives so it can be a useful conversation? And then something else that people probably are aware of. So probably a lot of people are aware of it, but the question is, how do you do it successfully within a retrospective or within a team is using thank you cards, right? And so calling out the things that you're thankful for. So in this sort of more virtual environment that we're in, there's Microsoft Teams, there's Miro, there's no shortage of collaborative tools. So there's some type of team board where you can call that out sort of as the sprint's going. And what you're doing is the thank you cards are reinforcing the positive behaviors, right, that have taken place by one or a couple of individuals. So that's reinforcing it. And then asking the tough question, right? So when you're thinking about retrospectives are the best place to have this type of conversation, which is when you're holding folks accountable, you say, for this example, so we agreed to do 10, for example, we agreed to do 10 stories and we got 5 done. So what does the team think about what that means for how that looks for demo and ultimately the larger set of teams that we're supporting? And just let it sit, as we're doing now. So you just let that sit.
Absolutely. And actually, one of the things that you said, and just let it sit, because very often, and I'm sure I am surely one that is guilty of doing that. We ask a question and then, there's a bit of silence and I kind of tend to, jump in again. And it does take effort for me to just hold it and let the team think through before they even, they say anything about the topic. And that's actually, for me, that's one of the easiest things to do in terms of holding teams accountable, right? You ask the question, but you don't provide any answer. You don't provide any next steps. The team needs to take in the question. And of course, they might decide to ignore it. And that's fine. That's also a statement of intent and a statement of motivation, even for the topic we are talking about. But as Scrum Master, just asking that question, hey guys, we had promised other teams that we work with that we would deliver these stories, but we didn't. And the same happened last sprint. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I think I would adjust it a little bit from a technique I had learned, which is using powerful questions, which is to use what or how with my question to frame it. But I'm 100% on board with you. I think also in this virtual environment, there's the concept of having fun. And so it's a little tougher if you're new with the team, but it can still be done, which is having fun with it. Right. So if you're like you and I working with teams, I suspect wouldn't have an issue or a problem saying something like, "Come on, guys, really? We got half done. Is that really what we want to do?" Right? Like you can have some fun with it, and if you've got some pretty good rapport, then you got to then use that as a technique to leaning into it, and that's one way to disarm some folks. And so that's one technique. Another is the pause and hold. And I agree with you. Just sitting there and letting silence be silence on a virtual call is bonkers. In person, it's a little easier because you can read body language. So it's not necessarily silent. But now when some people have their webcams off or some have it on, there's a mix. So it's definitely a tougher approach, but it can still be done. And then there's the ultimate one, which might be another approach, which is asking folks to do a little bit of pre-work before retrospective, which is, can you write down on a 3x5 card? One of my favorite tools is just talking about like, okay, so what are the challenges? How would you overcome it? And can you take a good 15 minutes and do this before the retrospective so that you're comfortable talking about it? Because some teams have some quiet folks. So there are a couple of techniques right there that I think people can use.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, what have you in practice learned that works when holding teams and organizations accountable to actually create, to foster a culture of improvement and learning? Because, of course, very often the risk is that it becomes a defensive culture, right? It's like this afraid of being blamed and then start pointing fingers. But what we want is the team to take whatever happened and transform it into either an improvement or something they've learned about themselves as a team or as individuals, right?
Sure. So I'd say first off, the first thing you got to do, and this I think can work in every situation, which is you have to sit back and you have to observe, because every situation, while there's executives, there's middle managers, and there's a team and sort of the hierarchy in the organization, those things might be in place, but you don't know what everyone's motivation is when you're working. And if you're at the team level, if you're a Scrum Master, you may not be exposed to what the managers and executives' motivation is for moving to Agile. For example, some people might be moving because they're fundamentally and financially need to make a change. So like they've had their come to Jesus moment and they're like, yeah, we're doing this. Like it's going to happen. So they're bought in a way that other companies may not be, that have not had their come to Jesus. So you have to kind of figure out, like, is the executive team and manager team, are they in that sort of come to Jesus component, or are they in a, hey, this is just sort of how software gets done in 2020, 2021, whatever. And if they're in that camp, then it's a little bit more passive. They're not looking at it like, we have to get this right. We have to move this forward, right? There are severe consequences. Those mindsets, those two alone take information very differently. And people move with a mission when they're in a dire circumstance with, we are going to get this done. And every day is, I must make an impact. And if you're not in that situation, you don't generally think that way, culturally speaking, right? So you got to figure out where you are. But once you figure out where you are, some things that some folks may have heard of that I think really are time tested is gimbal walks, which is walking around when we're physical and asking questions. And so we've got the questions to ask. So you combine those two things, that leads to really supporting the teams. And then how you do that and how often you do that sort of in our virtual sense is another way. So just using IM chat and just pinging and reaching out to folks, depending on your culture. So you got to understand your culture. So learn the technique and figure out one or two techniques that resonate with you, so it comes from a real place, an authentic place for who you are as a person, and then figure out how to apply it in your culture. And that's the better way to think about it, because there's a lot of different techniques. And so that's why I love your podcasts and in your blog, because lots of people have a fair amount of different techniques, but they find things that work for them because it's coming from how they think of the world and how they connect with people. So when they use the approach that is effective for them, it's effective because it's how they work with people, right? So it's natural for who they are. And so I'd say when we are building our craft, it is trying to find more techniques that resonate with us. And so I'd say this ebook really helps to give you or the reader a number of techniques that they can use that will resonate with them so that they can go and be their authentic self. And it doesn't come off as, well, I'm using, step 4, 5, 6 in this manual and going to probe you for figuring out how to interact, right? Like, so we don't want to do that. That's an anti-pattern for sure.
So if you look back, I mean, you've written the book now, but there's a lot of experience behind what is in the book. So if you look back, what's the one lesson you wish you had learned way back when you started as a Scrum Master and an Agile coach about specifically holding teams accountable?
Oh, yeah. The one I shared with you already about having fun with the situation, it took me a while to learn that one. And I realized that's, for me, was turning into the steer, or turning into the skid, I guess is the right way to, that using that driving metaphor. And that is having fun. And so I'd say a team I was working with, and they were a good team. So it wasn't a team where there was anyone who was negative, but we weren't consistently meeting. Like you go 2 or 3 sprints and things are consistent and you're doing well, and then you miss a couple and then you go back. So it was just sort of very consistently inconsistent, if you will, right? So like there was enough good stuff that it's like, oh, like you can tell it's working, but not consistent where it's like, oh, for the last 10 sprints, it's been X, right? And it's just been boom, 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 boom. And so I realized, there were a couple folks on the team who had a pretty good sense of humor. So I just walked over to someone before retrospective and I said, hey, I'm going to pick on you a little bit during this retrospective, but I didn't mean pick on them like saying you did anything. It was a person on the team who hadn't specifically done anything, but they had a really good sense of humor about it. And so I sort of used that sort of humor approach, and I think that was disarming. And so from that perspective, because the team got along really well, so it wasn't an issue about the people dynamics. It was an issue of trying to figure out how they could hold themselves accountable. And so when they realized you can go up to someone and go like, hey, I need that thing that you said you were going to go do. Like, can we do that? And so the team sort of figured out a natural way that they could communicate amongst themselves that they didn't perceive that it was, I'll call it like, your parents coming to you to tell you to go clean your room. Cause that's like, I don't really want to hear that. Right. Like I want to hear the feedback, but I want to hear the feedback in a way that's constructive. And so they had to have that elephant in the room conversation. So we did that. And so that was the turning point for the team. And if I had known that I could do that a little bit sooner, I would have done it a little bit sooner, but for whatever reason, I just didn't know. And I think that's another element of this book, is really just sharing a lot of the different things that I've learned over my career in a way that's constructive, where people can just read the ebook, because it's not one of these long, 100-page sorts of things. They can just sort of dive in, look at the index, and just jump right to the thing that they're looking for and get some value.
Absolutely. So we're getting close to the end. Justin, where can people find the book?
Oh, yeah. So you can find it at my blog. My website is ponolabs.com. And on the right-hand side, there's a link for getting the ebook. So pretty straightforward. And then there's a bunch of blog posts as well for other topics that I have.
Absolutely. We'll put the link on the show notes so that people can easily find it and read it. And how about you, Justin? Where can people find out more about you and the work that you're doing?
Yeah, my blog is the single best place to learn about what I'm doing and what I'm thinking about. So the blog is where I'm experimenting with the team canvas that you mentioned in the intro. So I've got that up there. People can pull that down and use that. And then I just released a new infographic about project managers versus Scrum Masters. And so that's up there as well. And people can check that out and kind of use that to help support them in whatever culture that they're in, to help have that conversation about the nuance between Scrum Master and project managers.
Absolutely. Well, Justin, thank you very much for your generosity with your time and your knowledge.
Well, thank you, Vasco, for having me, and be well.
We really hope you liked our show. And if you did, why not rate this podcast on Stitcher or iTunes? Share this podcast and let other Scrum Masters know about this valuable resource for their work. Remember that sharing is caring.